From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Russia produces about 10 million barrels of oil every day. That's about 10% of current global consumption. And analysts, like people who spend their lives studying the fossil fuel industry, are concerned that oil prices could surge to $120 a barrel thanks to this conflict. And again, when we talk about resources, we have to emphasize people's lives are more important. Right. You can replace a resource. You cannot replace a human life. They are individual, distinct, and unique. But people like Patrick Dehaan, who is the head of petroleum analysis at a place, I love the name of this place, Gas Buddy, said that this Gas Buddy.
Gas Buddy's
so our
great.
gas buddies are saying that a move to $120 per barrel of oil, and listen to our previous episodes on big oil to figure out what a barrel means. This rise to $120 could increase U.S. gas prices to $4 a gallon or in excess of $4 a gallon. We mentioned Russia is also the biggest wheat exporter. It's a huge producer of precious metals like palladium, aluminum, nickel. We also said Ukraine has a lot of uranium, titanium, steel. What we're saying is when those operations of resource movement and allocation are disrupted, it hits everyone. There's not there. You can aim something like economic warfare. You can aim it at an initial country, but especially now, it's going to be like saying you want to poison one part of the ocean, because the ocean is its own inextricably connected thing. So that's part of why Russia is only partially removed from SWIFT, because the people of Western Europe need to not freeze, honestly. And that's also part of why the U.S. called it a nuclear option. If we're going to wax poetic, let's just say the quiet part out loud. A long, long time ago, Uncle Sam figured out that there are times where you can use U.S. dollars the same way you would use bullets or missiles. You can weaponize the dollar. We talked about this in our petrodollar episode, right? Like the global reserve currency. The SWIFT is the common tongue or the WhatsApp or the signal for banks. But when it comes to currency, the U.S. dollar is the most widely accepted currency in the world. If you have $10, if you have like an old school $10 bill from the United States, your odds of someone letting you use that to pay for something or buy something are much higher than almost any other currency. You know, that's just the reality. It is economic dominance. It is an economic hegemon. And the U.S. has tremendous privilege as the sole issuer of the world's de facto reserve currency. They use it as a carrot stick tool in global policy all the time. Pretty much every place on earth accepts cash. Even countries that are fundamentally opposed to the United States will say, okay, burn the U.S. to the ground, but we will accept dollars if you have dollars. No checks.
So back in 2014, the Obama administration blocked several Russian banks from SWIFT as the relationship between our country and Russia began to deteriorate. Trump, on the other hand, threatened to lock China out of the dollar system if it failed to follow UN sanctions on North Korea. We know that Trump was very vocal in his opposition to China, and a little bit on the cozy side.
Yeah, shout out to the compromat. I still wonder what's in that Steele dossier. You know what I mean?
The PP tape?
Well, that's the rumor, but it hasn't been confirmed. You know.
No.
Also, we are in the midst of a new kind of war. You know, it's very much a war of information. It's taking place on two separate fronts. Every war now. So these sanctions do affect the economy. In 2014, Prime Minister Medvedev said that sanctions resulted in a loss of tens of billions of dollars of value. So it hits hard. But we have to talk a little bit more about future and past concerns, what SWIFT means to Russia, what SWIFT means to Ukraine, what SWIFT means to Europe, and ultimately what SWIFT means to you and what the fallout of this will be. Because just like a bomb, there is fallout, and it's on the way. We're not being hyperbolic. Economic warfare is not a missile or a bomb, but this removal from SWIFT, even though it's partial, it does remain a weapon of war, and it functions as one. In fact, you could make the argument that it's more dangerous in some ways because it's less easy to control, which makes it therefore less predictable. So if this is such a powerful weapon, why did some European countries hesitate to make this move? I mean, I love what you pointed out earlier, Noel. Yes, Russia was well aware of the fallout. Nobody in this conversation is particularly thick or dunderheaded. Russia has been attempting to mitigate the possible damage of this economic warfare for quite some time. And as we discussed in our previous episode, they're the ones with their hand on the faucet for much of Europe's energy supply. So members of Russian parliament, I should say, even said as much. They said, look, if Russia is taken off of SWIFT, then you, Europe, will have to find your gas somewhere else. And that could spell disaster for millions of innocent people. As a matter of fact, as we're recording now, the United States is actively selling energy, fossil fuels, to Europe at a lower rate to try to get in front of the idea of Europe without energy. And we also know that this has inspired further pushes toward alternative energy in Europe because they don't want to be hooked on the gas, right? They don't want to be addicted to gas the same way that in Iran or in North Korea or in Russia, their perspective is they don't want to be addicted to the U.S. dollar. Russia's taken some pretty proactive steps to try to get in front of this. Everybody is trying to predict the next move, and everybody is trying to sort of indemnify themselves against the consequences. Does that make sense?
And Russia is no stranger to sanctions. They know what happened in, around 2008 with Georgia, and 2014 with Crimea, and they actually started making moves, probably thinking in long game terms, as they tend to do, that this stuff might happen again. We might end up being kicked out of SWIFT at some point. So they started, I guess you can call it a homegrown SWIFT. They got swifty with it and created this thing called SPFS. It's the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, a very similar thing to use. And they've got several hundred members of that thing already, just internally within Russia and a couple other member states outside. So they've got something they can use that isn't SWIFT. While it isn't the same number of connections and the same level of power, it still functions.
Right. So it means that you can, if you are Russia, you can say, SWIFT's not really popping for us right now, but have you heard of SPFS? That's the new kid on the block. They also purchased a lot of gold. Wait, I can't say a ton. For non-Americans, it's really common for us to say a ton when we mean a lot of something, but it is very much not an accurate expression. I think if you look at it, when you say a ton of people, we pointed this out on air earlier. A ton of people is like 12 to 13 people. It's not a lot of people, depending on their weight. Oh, Matt, I see you looking it up. All right. So, so there's a old school analog solution to moving away from the dollar, which is you accumulate treasure. Just like a dragon in a fantasy novel, you get a hoard of gold and you sit on it. And then when people say, hey, we want this thing, or you say, hey, I want this thing, you just pay them in something shiny and metallic. Before ending their purchase program at the onset of the COVID pandemic, Russia was the world's largest central bank buyer of gold. The Central Bank of Russia, think of it like the government's bank, essentially. The Central Bank of Russia bought $4.3 billion worth of gold in just over the year of June 2019 to June 2020 alone. And it turns out they've been buying tons of gold way, way before that. So at the same time they're doing this, they have been aggressively selling off their U.S. debt holding. As we discussed earlier, debt for a country is way different than debt for regular folks. You know what I mean? At times, it is quite beneficial for a country to have some sort of international debt. Like other countries buying up United States debt actually shores up and strengthens the status of the U.S. dollar. But this leads, so we're getting in the weeds, but this leads us to something really important. You need to know, we need to be aware that everything is a precedent. In the world of geopolitics, very, very, very few things are one-offs. The weaponization of SWIFT does have a precedent in earlier years. It has been applied. Iran, for instance, and other similar financial sanctions. So it has a precedent, but it also, so it comes from a precedent, but it also sets a precedent for future conflicts. We say it all the time now. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Experts, economic analysts, again, people who spend their lives studying this, folks like Peter Schiff, are well aware of this. They are warning that other countries are watching how the U.S. handles its economic power during this conflict.